Welcome to Dusky Lore. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and listen closely as the shadows begin to speak. Story 1. Snow has a particular sound when it falls at night. It is like a faint murmur, a kind of soft whisper that most people would probably find comforting. But when you sleep under a bridge or tucked behind a dumpster, that whisper feels more like a countdown. Every flake that lands on your sleeping bag is another tiny weight piling up on top of you. Another degree of warmth your body loses. Another minute bringing you closer to the moment when you may never wake up again. I turned 34 the same week the first serious storm hit Omaha last January. Someone at the community dining hall gave me a dried-out cupcake with a crooked candle, and I stared at it for a long time before I could eat it. Not because I was not grateful, but because birthdays on the street feel like fake celebrations, like throwing a party on a sinking ship. Yes, you survived another year, but at what cost? And for how much longer? Pete Garrison understood that feeling better than anyone I knew out there. We had met 2 winters earlier at a warming center near the old railroad depot. Both of us were shaking so violently that our teeth were clacking in the same rhythm, as if they were some broken percussion instrument. Pete must have been around 55. He had a gray beard stained yellow around the mouth from decades of cigarettes, and he had those watery blue eyes that always seemed to be searching for something he had lost and would never find again. He once told me he had worked as a plumber for 23 years, that he had owned a little house with the mortgage completely paid off, and a wife named Ruth, who made the best chicken pot pie in all of Nebraska. Then Ruth got pancreatic cancer, and 6 months later, Pete was sitting in an empty house that suddenly felt like a tomb. Grief ate him alive from the inside. He stopped going to work, stopped paying the bills, stopped caring whether he was alive or not. By the time he ended up on the street, he said it almost felt like a relief, as if he had finally stopped pretending that a life without Ruth was worth fighting for. That January had been brutal from the beginning, but the weather forecast for that particular Wednesday made even the people most used to surviving harsh winters nervous. The temperature was expected to drop to minus 15 degrees, with a wind chill close to minus 30. I remember standing outside the library on Monday afternoon, watching people hurry past in their padded jackets and heated car seats, thinking about how fragile the line is that separates their world from mine. One bad month, one medical bill, one layoff. That is all it takes. The shelters were already warning that they would be over capacity, that they would turn people away through some kind of lottery system, like a macabre contest where the losers could freeze to death. Pete and I talked that afternoon about our options, sitting on milk crates behind the Vietnamese store where the owner sometimes let us warm ourselves near the rear vent. We decided to stay together and look for a spot in the underground parking garage on Farnham Street, where the concrete held some warmth from the cars coming and going. But Pete never showed up that night. I waited for him until almost 9, stomping my feet and blowing into my hands, watching my breath crystallize before disappearing into the darkness. He had mentioned something about checking the recycling bins near the university. He collected cans and bottles to buy cigarettes, one of the few pleasures he had left. I figured maybe he had found a better spot or managed to get into one of the church basements that sometimes open during emergencies. I told myself I should not worry, that Pete had survived worse winters than that one, that he knew the tricks better than most. So I settled alone into a corner of the parking garage, wrapped myself in every piece of fabric I had, and tried to sleep while the wind howled outside like something hungry. My dreams were fragmented and strange, full of images of Ruth standing in a kitchen I had never seen, calling Pete toward a door filled with white light. I woke up around 4 in the morning, shaking uncontrollably, and at that very moment I knew something was wrong. The sun came up around 7:30, pale and distant, as if it were ashamed to show its face after what the night had done. I started walking toward the university, retracing the route Pete usually took when he went collecting. The streets were quiet in that unsettling way they get after a deep freeze. There were no runners, no people walking dogs, just the occasional car moving slowly with frost still clinging to the windows. My boots crunched against the salt-covered sidewalks, and every breath felt like I was inhaling broken glass. I checked the usual places. The alley behind the student union, where the recycling bins overflowed on weekends. The loading dock near the science building, where warm air sometimes escaped from the ventilation system. The bus stop on Dodge Street, where Pete liked to sit and watch the college students pass by. Nothing. No sign of him. A janitor coming out of one of the dorms looked at me with that familiar mixture of pity and disgust. I wanted to grab him by his clean uniform and ask if he had seen an older man with a yellowed beard, but I knew exactly how that would end. I found Pete in the narrow alley between a laundromat and a pawn shop on Leavenworth Street, about 6 blocks from where I had been searching. He was sitting against the brick wall, his legs stretched out in front of him and his hands resting on his thighs, as if he had simply decided to pause and catch his breath. For one horrible second, I thought he was still alive. His eyes were open, staring fixedly at the dumpster across from him, and on his face there was an almost peaceful expression, as if he had finally found the answer to a question that had been tormenting him for years. But then I moved closer and saw the frost on his eyelashes, the blue tint around his lips, the waxy texture his skin had taken on, a texture no living human being ever has. I said his name once, twice, 3 times, each time louder than the last. But my voice only bounced off the walls and vanished into the frozen air. Pete was gone. He had been dead for hours, probably since before midnight, when the temperature bottomed out and his body simply surrendered to the cold. I sat down beside him on that frozen concrete, no longer caring about preserving my own body heat, and I stayed there for what felt like an eternity. His shopping cart was parked a few steps away, still loaded with plastic bags full of cans and bottles he had gathered. Maybe $8 total if he was lucky. That was what his final hours on Earth had consisted of, digging through trash so he could buy a pack of cigarettes and maybe a cup of coffee at the gas station. I noticed he was not wearing gloves. He had probably lost them or had them stolen weeks earlier. His hands were bare and slightly curled inward, like claws. His fingernails had turned a deep purple, almost black. I reached out and touched his shoulder, and it was like touching a statue, completely rigid, utterly removed from anything resembling human warmth. A sound came out of my mouth that I did not recognize, something between a moan and a scream. I rested my forehead against his arm and let the pain pass through me like a winter wind, finding every crack in a broken window. Eventually, a woman walked past the entrance to the alley, probably on her way to work at one of the shops on the street. She looked in, looked again in shock, and took out her phone to call 911. I heard her sharp, frightened voice describing what she saw. 2 homeless men, one possibly dead. Please send someone quickly. She did not come closer. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not offer any comfort. She just stood at the mouth of the alley with the phone pressed to her ear, staring at us as if we were animals in a zoo exhibit that had suddenly become disturbing instead of entertaining. The paramedics arrived about 15 minutes later, followed by a patrol car with 2 officers who already looked bored before they even got out of the car. One of them asked me if I knew the deceased. I almost laughed when I heard the word deceased, as if Pete were nothing more than a file to process, a statistic to record. A problem that had been courteous enough to solve itself by dying in an alley where no one important would have to see him. They put Pete in a black body bag and loaded him into a van that did not even have windows in the back. I asked one of the paramedics where they were taking him, and she told me to the county morgue, where he would remain until they could locate a next of kin, or if they could not, arrange an indigent burial in the municipal cemetery. I thought about Pete's daughter, the one he had mentioned only once in all the time I knew him. She lived somewhere in California and had changed her phone number years earlier after too many desperate calls asking for money. He never blamed her for cutting him out of her life. He said he understood that watching someone you love destroy himself is a form of torture, that sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is walk away before the drowning man drags you down with him. But as I stood there watching that van drive away with his body inside, I wondered whether she would ever find out. Whether some bureaucrat would manage to track her down and give her the news over the phone as if it were an overdue library notice. Your father is dead. He froze to death behind a laundromat. Would you like to claim the body? This is what people do not understand about dying from exposure to the cold. It is not like in the movies, where someone dramatically collapses onto a snowbank. Hypothermia is slow, treacherous, and almost delicate in its cruelty. Your body begins by pulling blood away from the extremities, sacrificing fingers and toes to keep the core warm. You feel a deep, painful cold that settles into your bones like something alive. Then the shivering begins, violent and uncontrollable. Your muscles burn through the little energy you have left trying to produce heat. But eventually the shivering stops, and that is when you know you are in real danger. Your body has stopped fighting, accepted defeat, and begun shutting systems down one by one like a building going dark floor by floor. The strangest thing is that near the end, many people actually feel warm. Their confused brains misinterpret the signals, and they begin taking off their clothes, convinced they are overheating. It is called paradoxical undressing, and it is one of the ways they identify hypothermia victims. Pete was still wearing all his clothes when I found him, so at least he was spared that final humiliation. But I think about those last hours alone in that alley, and I wonder whether he called out for Ruth, whether he believed she was coming to take him home. The newspapers published a small note the next day, buried somewhere in the local section between a report about a school board meeting and a furniture liquidation ad. "Homeless man found dead in downtown alley," the headline said. They did not even print his name. They only described him as a white man in his 50s. No identification was found among his belongings. The presumed cause of death was exposure to extreme cold. That was all. That was the complete sum of Pete Garrison's obituary. A man who had repaired pipes, paid taxes, loved his wife, and lived an entire life before the world decided he was disposable. The article mentioned that 3 other homeless individuals had died that same week in different parts of the city, bringing the season's total to 11. 11 people frozen to death in a country that throws away enough food to feed entire nations. In a city with empty office buildings, heated parking garages, and churches on every corner preaching about loving your neighbor. I kept that newspaper clipping for months folded in the pocket of my coat until the paper grew soft and started coming apart at the creases. I wanted to remember the exact number, 11, because someone had to. A year has passed since then, and I am still here, fighting the same war Pete lost. Last spring, I got a spot in a transitional housing program. It is a tiny room with a lock on the door and a radiator that bangs and hisses like an angry cat, but it keeps me warm. I think about Pete every day, especially when the temperature drops and I see news reports about warming centers opening their doors and donation drives collecting coats. The problem is that coats are not enough. Shelters are not enough either. Not when there are more people than beds and those left outside have to flip a coin with their own lives. What Pete needed, what all of us need, is for people to stop looking at us as if we were ghosts, to stop treating homelessness like a personal failure and start seeing it as a systemic catastrophe. Pete did not die because he was weak or lazy, or because he had made bad choices. He died because a society capable of sending rockets into space could not find a way to keep an old man destroyed by grief from freezing to death 6 blocks from a heated shopping center. I carry that truth with me now. I carry it carved into my chest like a scar that will never fully heal. And I tell it to anyone willing to listen. Pete Garrison was my friend. He had a name, a history, a soul. And he deserved so much more than an unmarked grave in a frozen field on the outskirts of the city. Story 2. My car became my apartment on a rainy Wednesday in September, and I wish I could say it was something dramatic or cinematic, but it was not. 6 months after graduating from Ohio State with a degree in communications, my apartment lease ended and I had exactly $400 to my name. My roommate had moved to Seattle with her boyfriend. My temporary job at the insurance company had ended, and my parents, well, let's just say going back to their house in Akron was not an option after everything that had happened. So there I was, 24 years old, a journalism degree gathering dust, and my entire life crammed into the back seat of my 2009 Toyota Corolla. I had chosen the McDonald's parking lot on Cedar Road in Beechwood because it stayed open late, had decent Wi-Fi that reached into the parking lot, and the fluorescent lights made me feel a little less alone. I kept telling myself it would only be for a few weeks, just until I found something stable. That had been 3 weeks earlier, and by then I had already developed an entire routine. Park in the same corner after 11, use the bathroom before they closed it, sleep with the pepper spray wedged between the driver's seat and the center console. That particular night was a Thursday in early October, and the temperature had dropped to maybe around 45 degrees. I remember because I was wearing 2 sweatshirts under my winter coat and still woke up shaking around 2 in the morning. By then, the parking lot was almost empty. There was only my car, an old pickup truck near the drive-thru that had already been there before I arrived, and a white van parked at the far end next to the dumpsters. I had gotten used to sleeping lightly, waking up every time a headlight swept across my windshield or whenever someone walked too close to the car. But when I opened my eyes that night, something was different. The air inside the vehicle felt strange somehow, heavy, charged, like that moment right before a storm breaks. I blinked several times trying to get my eyes to adjust to the darkness, and that was when I saw him, a silhouette outside the driver's side window. It was not moving. It was not walking past. It was just standing there completely still, maybe 6 inches from the glass. My first instinct was to scream, but no sound came out. It was a man. I could tell that much from the shape of his body. Tall, maybe around 6 feet, dressed in what looked like a dark sweatshirt with the hood pulled up. His face was so close to the window that his breath fogged the glass in small rhythmic clouds. I could see the outline of his nose, his forehead, the way his hands curved around his eyes as if he were trying to look inside a display case, as if he were observing a storefront window. For a few seconds, which felt like hours, I lay there frozen, reclined in the seat, praying he could not see me through the condensation that had built up on the inside of the windows. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I did not move. I did not breathe. I only watched those small clouds of breath appear and disappear on the glass again and again while my mind raced through every possible scenario of what was about to happen. Then he moved toward the rear window. I heard his footsteps on the asphalt, slow, deliberate, in no hurry at all, and I saw his shadow shift along the edge of my vision until it stopped right behind me. The back seat was packed with everything I owned. Clothes and trash bags, a small cooler, my laptop bag, a pillow and a blanket I used every night. He stood there for what must have been 2 full minutes, simply looking at my things. And then I understood with nauseating clarity that he knew. He knew someone was living in that car. He had probably been watching me for days, maybe weeks, learning my routine, calculating when I was most vulnerable. The thought tightened around my chest so hard I thought I was going to pass out. I could hear him breathing, or maybe I was imagining it. In that silence, every sound seemed amplified. The distant hum of the highway, a car door closing somewhere far away, and beneath all of it, the soft scrape of his shoes when he moved again. He came back to the driver's side. This time he did not just look. I heard the click of the door handle being tested, first with a gentle pull, then with more force. The whole car shook slightly from the pressure. The locks were on. I always checked them 3 times before sleeping. But the sound of someone trying to enter your space, the only space you have in the entire world, is something that stays with you. He tried again, this time yanking violently, and I could hear him grunt from the effort. Then his face appeared beside the window again, and this time he was closer, his features barely visible under the orange glow of the parking lot lights. He looked normal. That was the worst part. He was not some wild-eyed lunatic. He did not look obviously dangerous. Just an ordinary guy, maybe in his 40s, with a receding hairline and stubble on his chin. The kind of face you would pass in a grocery store without looking twice. He smiled at the window, and even though I knew he probably could not see me clearly, it felt as if he were smiling directly at me. I do not know where the courage came from, but something inside me snapped. Maybe it was that smile, or maybe it was realizing that if I did not do something, I would stay there paralyzed until he found a way inside. I grabbed the pepper spray beside my seat, sat up as fast as I could, and slammed my palm down on the horn. The sound exploded through the empty parking lot like a bomb. The man stumbled backward, and his expression shifted from that calm smile into something like shock. For a fraction of a second, we stared at each other through the glass. I kept my hand pressed against the horn, the noise blaring and blaring without stopping. With my other hand, I raised the pepper spray so he could see it. I was screaming too, I think, although I do not remember what words came out. Probably nothing coherent, just pure sound. All the fear, rage, and helplessness of the last 3 weeks bursting out of me in one primitive explosion. He ran. Thank God, not toward me, but in the opposite direction, crossing the parking lot toward the white van beside the dumpsters. I watched him move away without letting go of the horn, my whole body shaking so violently that my teeth were chattering. The van's headlights came on, and within seconds it shot out of the parking lot, its tires squealing against the pavement. I managed to see part of the license plate, only the first 3 characters, BKV, before it disappeared down Cedar Road heading east. Only then did I take my hand off the horn. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. My ears were ringing, my throat felt raw, and I realized I was crying. Not soft tears, but ugly ones, the kind that distort your whole face, make your nose run, and keep you from catching your breath. I sat in the driver's seat, still gripping the pepper spray in my fist, and cried until I had nothing left. The night manager at McDonald's came outside about 5 minutes later. Her name was Brianna, a black woman in her 50s, heavy-set, with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and an expression that mixed concern and annoyance in equal measure. She had heard the horn from inside and wanted to know what the hell was going on. I tried to explain between hiccups and trembling breaths. The man, the window, the door handle. And I watched her expression change from irritation to something softer, something like compassion. She asked me if I was living in my car, and I could not lie. Not in that moment. I just nodded. She did not say anything judgmental. She did not tell me I could not park there anymore. She did not lecture me about making better decisions. She simply handed me a cup of hot coffee through the cracked window and told me she was going to call the police. I wanted to hug her. I also wanted to sink between the seat cushions and never be seen again. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 officers in a Beechwood patrol car. A young man with a buzz cut and an older woman with gray hair pulled back into a tight bun. They took my statement in the parking lot while Brianna watched from the door, her arms crossed against the cold. I told them everything. The man, the hooded sweatshirt, the way he had pressed his face to the glass, the partial plate number. The young officer wrote it all down in a small notebook while the older officer walked around my car with a flashlight, looking for signs that someone had tried to force it open. She found smudges on the driver's side window where his face had been and greasy fingerprints around the handle. They took pictures of everything. I could feel them looking at my car differently, noticing the trash bags full of clothes, the pillow in the back seat, the empty fast food wrappers I had not had a chance to throw away. I knew what they were thinking. I had seen that look before at gas stations and rest stops. The look that says, "How did you end up like this?" without actually asking the question. The older officer, whose badge said Sergeant Kimmel, asked me how long I had been sleeping in the parking lot. I told her 3 weeks. She asked me if I had anywhere else to go, any family or friends who could take me in. I said no, which was almost true. She did not press. Instead, she gave me a card for a women's shelter about 15 minutes away and told me that what had happened that night could have ended very differently. She did not say it cruelly, just as a fact, but her words hit me in the chest like a punch. I knew she was right. If the doors had not been locked, if I had not woken up exactly when I did, if I had not had the pepper spray within reach, the possibilities unfolded in my mind like a horror movie I could not turn off. The young officer said they would put out an alert for the white van, but his tone suggested he did not expect it to go very far. Partial plate, dark parking lot. No witness besides me. I understood. I was not naive enough to think they would catch him. After the police left, Brianna let me come inside to use the bathroom and wash my face. The fluorescent lights in there were merciless. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My eyes were swollen and red, my skin pale and blotchy, my hair a tangled mess from sleeping badly on it. I looked like someone who had been living in a car for 3 weeks, which I suppose made sense. I splashed cold water on my face and tried to pull myself together, but my hands would not stop shaking. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face in the window. That ordinary face with that horrible smile. Brianna was waiting for me when I came out, holding a bag with 2 cheeseburgers and a large order of fries. "On the house," she said. I started crying again, which was embarrassing, but she only patted me on the shoulder and told me to take care of myself. She said she had a daughter about my age, and that thinking about her alone out there in a parking lot made her stomach turn. I did not know what to say to that, so I just thanked her and went back to my car. I did not sleep the rest of the night. I drove to another parking lot, a Walmart about 10 miles away, and sat there with the doors locked and the pepper spray on my lap until the sun came up. Every van that passed made my heart race. Every person who walked too close to the car sent me spiraling into panic. When morning finally came, I called the shelter Sergeant Kimmel had mentioned. They had a bed available, and I accepted it. I stayed there for 6 weeks, long enough to save the deposit for a tiny studio apartment in Cleveland Heights, long enough to get a job at a call center that paid barely above minimum wage, but at least it paid something. I never went back to that McDonald's. I never saw the man from the white van again, although sometimes I wonder whether he found someone else. Someone whose doors were not locked. Someone who did not wake up in time. That thought keeps me awake more than any memory of his face beside my window. I was lucky. I know that now. And I hate that luck is what it takes to survive when you have nothing and nowhere to go. Story 3. Running away from home felt like freedom for about 3 days. After that, it just felt like being hungry, cold, and scared all the time. I was 17 in my junior year of high school, and I should have been worried about the SATs and prom dates. Instead, I ended up sleeping on a bench in Riverside Park beside a group of men who had been living on the street for years. My parents and I had been arguing constantly ever since my dad lost his job. One night, after a screaming fight about my grades, I simply stuffed a few things into a backpack and left. I thought I was making some kind of statement. I thought they would come looking for me, that they would beg me to come back. No one came. When I left home, I had $40 in my pocket. By the 4th day, I had nothing left. Pride is a stupid thing when your stomach starts eating itself. The group I ended up staying around was mostly harmless. There was an older man everyone called Patches because of his jacket. There was also a woman named Rita, who talked to herself but always shared her food when she had any. There was a younger guy, maybe in his 20s, named Scotty, with bad teeth and a nervous laugh. And then there was Carl. Carl was different from the others. He was quiet, kept to himself, and the other homeless people seemed to avoid him. He must have been around 50 with a gray beard and watery blue eyes that never seemed to fully focus on anything. He had a shopping cart full of things that he guarded as if they were gold. He slept on the farthest edge of our little camp, away from everyone. The others whispered that Carl had money hidden somewhere, that he was sitting on a small fortune but was too crazy to spend it. I never believed that, but I did notice that Carl always had food, snacks, granola bars, sometimes even sandwiches. And on the 5th night, when I had gone almost 2 days without eating anything, I could not stop looking at his cart. It was around 2 in the morning when I made the decision. Everyone was asleep, or at least pretending to be. The park was completely silent except for the occasional car passing on the street beyond the trees. I had been lying on my bench for hours, unable to sleep because my stomach would not stop twisting. Hunger no longer felt like anything I had experienced before. It was not simple discomfort anymore. It was pain. Real pain. like something was clawing at me from the inside. I saw Carl sleeping near his cart, wrapped in a dirty sleeping bag, and I told myself it was just a candy bar, just one bar. He had plenty. He would not even notice. I got up slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and crept toward his cart. My hands found a Snickers bar near the top of one of his plastic bags. I grabbed it and went back to my bench. The whole thing took maybe 15 seconds. I ate that bar in 3 bites, barely tasting it, simply shoving it into my mouth like an animal. The next morning started like any other. People waking up little by little, moving stiffly. Rita muttering her usual nonsense while folding her blankets. I was still hungry, but the worst had passed and I felt something almost like relief. That relief lasted about 20 minutes. That was when Carl woke up and started going through his cart. I watched him from the other side of the camp, pretending to be busy with my backpack, but I could see everything. He was counting his things, checking his bags, and then suddenly he stopped. His whole body went rigid. He checked again, this time more desperately, rummaging through the plastic bags and pulling things out. Then he stood up and looked around the camp with those watery eyes. For 1 second, I thought he was looking directly at me. My chest tightened, but his gaze moved past me and landed on Scotty, who was sitting on a milk crate about 10 feet from Carl's cart, closer than anyone else. Scotty had no idea what was happening. He was just sitting there, picking at the little pieces of skin around his fingernails, not paying attention to anything. Carl walked toward Scotty with that slow, calculated step that made my stomach turn. He stopped right in front of him and stood there for a moment, staring down at him. Scotty looked up with that nervous smile of his, the one that showed his damaged teeth, and said something like, "Hey man, what's up?" Carl did not answer. He only asked him in a very low voice where his things were. Scotty looked confused. He said he did not know what Carl was talking about. Carl asked again, this time louder, and I could hear the edge in his voice. He said someone had taken food from his cart and that Scotty had been sleeping right beside it. Scotty started shaking his head, saying it was not him, that he had not taken anything, that he would never do something like that. But Carl was not listening. The other people in the camp started paying attention. Patches got up from his spot near the fountain, watching. Rita stopped muttering. Everyone was looking at Carl and Scotty, and I was still sitting on my bench, paralyzed, with the taste of that Snickers still in my mouth. I should have said something. That is what I tell myself now, years later. I should have stood up and confessed what I had done. But I was 17, scared and stupid, and I just sat there watching it all unfold as if it were happening on a television screen. Carl grabbed Scotty by the front of his jacket and yanked him off the milk crate. Scotty was smaller than Carl, thinner, weaker. He tried to pull away, but Carl had a strong grip on him. Scotty kept saying it was not him. Please, it was not him. But Carl kept repeating, "Where are my things?" louder and louder each time. Then Carl threw the first punch. He hit Scotty directly in the face, and I heard that sound, that wet impact, a kind of soft crack that I can still hear when I close my eyes at night. Scotty fell hard, and Carl got on top of him. The other homeless people just watched. No one moved to help. No one said anything. I think they were all afraid of Carl, or maybe they simply did not want to get involved. Either way, they stood there still, and so did I. What happened next is something I have never been able to fully describe to anyone. Carl beat Scotty for what felt like an eternity, although it was probably only a few minutes. He hit him in the face, in the ribs, in the stomach. Scotty tried to cover himself, curling into a ball on the ground, but Carl kept attacking him. At some point, Scotty stopped making sounds. He stopped trying to protect himself. His arms simply dropped to his sides and he lay there while Carl continued hitting him. I remember the sounds more than anything else, the dull muffled thud of fists against flesh, Carl's heavy breathing, his grunts with every blow, and that horrible bubbling sound coming from Scotty, as if he were trying to breathe through liquid. I wanted to scream, run, do something, but my body would not move. It was as if my feet had been nailed to the ground. I stood there watching an innocent man get beaten nearly to death because I had stolen a candy bar, because I was hungry, because I was selfish, and because I was too much of a coward to speak. Carl finally stopped when he ran out of energy. He was panting, his knuckles bloody, and he stood over Scotty for a long moment, looking at what he had done. Then he spat on him and went back to his cart as if nothing had happened. Scotty was not moving. His face was unrecognizable, swollen and covered in blood, and there was a dark pool forming beneath his head on the concrete. Rita started crying, quiet sobs that sounded more like hiccups. Patches pulled out an old flip phone and said he was going to call an ambulance. Carl simply sat down beside his cart and started eating a granola bar, calm as if he had just finished some light exercise. No one looked at me. No one suspected the skinny teenager who had only been there for a few days. Why would they? I was just a kid who had run away from home. Scotty was the one sleeping closest to Carl's cart. It made sense that it had been him. Except it had not been him. It had been me. And Scotty was lying on the ground, maybe dying because of me. The ambulance took almost 20 minutes to arrive. 20 minutes in which I sat on that bench staring at Scotty's body, waiting for him to move, to make some sound, to do anything that proved he was still alive. He did not move. His chest rose and fell, but barely, and the blood kept spreading beneath his head. When the paramedics finally showed up, they worked on him for quite a while before loading him onto a stretcher. One of them asked what had happened, and Patches only said there had been a fight, a dispute over something stolen. The paramedic looked at all of us, at that group of dirty, homeless people standing in a city park at 7 in the morning, and I could see the judgment in his eyes. He did not ask any more questions. The police arrived shortly after. 2 officers who took statements from Patches and Rita, but who did not seem especially interested in investigating further. By then, Carl had already disappeared, slipping away with his cart while everyone was focused on Scotty. One of the officers asked me if I had seen anything, and I said I had been asleep when it started. I lied to his face. He wrote something in his little notebook, walked away, and that was it. No one was going to work too hard investigating a fight between homeless men in a park. I left the camp about an hour after the police were gone. I did not say goodbye to anyone. I just grabbed my backpack and started walking. No destination. I just needed to move, to get away from that place where Scotty's blood was still drying on the concrete. I walked for hours through the city, past stores, restaurants, and normal people living their normal lives. And I could not stop thinking about what I had done. Not just the theft, but the silence, the cowardice. I had watched an innocent man nearly beaten to death and had said nothing. I had lied to the police. I was complicit in something terrible, and there was no way to undo it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Scotty's face, the way it looked before and the way it looked after. And I heard that bubbling sound he made when he could no longer breathe properly. I found a payphone around noon. I do not even know why I stopped there. My feet simply carried me to it, and before I realized what I was doing, I was already dialing my home number. My mom answered on the second ring. She did not yell. That was what broke me. I expected screaming. Anger, all the things we had been throwing at each other for months. Instead, her voice cracked and she just repeated my name over and over, as if she could not believe it was really me. She asked me where I was, if I was okay, if I was hurt. I could hear my dad in the background asking who was on the phone. And then I heard the sound he made when she told him it was me. A choked, desperate sound I had never heard him make before. I told them where I was, a downtown intersection I barely recognized. My mom said they were coming to get me, that I should stay there, that I should not move, that they were on their way. I hung up, sat down on the curb, and started crying. It was not silent crying, but ugly, loud sobs that made people on the street look at me as they passed. I cried for Scotty, who for all I knew might already have been dead by then. I cried for myself, for how stupid and selfish I had been. I cried because my parents still loved me after all, and I did not deserve it. My dad's truck pulled up beside the curb about 40 minutes later. When he got out and saw me sitting there, dirty, thin, and broken, He did not say a word. He simply walked over to me and hugged me so hard I thought he was going to break my ribs. I never told them what really happened in that park. I never told anyone until now. I said I had been sleeping on the street, that it had been hard, that I wanted to come home. All of that was true, just not the whole truth. I went back to school, finished my junior year, and graduated the following spring. I went to a community college, got a job, and built something resembling a normal life. But I never stopped thinking about Scotty. For months, I searched for news about him. I searched the internet trying to find some report about a homeless man beaten in Riverside Park, but I never found anything. I do not know whether he lived or died. I do not know if they ever caught Carl. That uncertainty is its own form of punishment. Some nights I think I still dream about it. I am back on that bench watching Carl walk towards Scotty, and I open my mouth to say, "It was me. I took it. Leave him alone." But no sound comes out. I just sit there in silence while everything happens all over again. Now I am 24 years old, and I have not stolen anything since that morning. Not a candy bar, not a pen, not anything. That does not make up for what I did. Nothing ever can. But it is the only promise I know how to keep. Story 4. November can be merciless in Portland, Oregon, and that year, it arrived with a fury that cut through any layer of clothing you managed to put on. My high school class had graduated in 2009, and while most of my former classmates were building careers and families, I had been sleeping under bridges and in parking lots for almost 3 years. A bad divorce, an even worse drinking problem, and a chain of decisions I still regret cost me my job as a warehouse supervisor, and eventually my apartment too. By the time that Friday night came around, I had learned the rhythm of survival on the street pretty well. You find your places. You learn which shelters have beds and which ones only bring trouble. And most important of all, you find your people. That night I was on my way to an abandoned lot near Burnside, where a group of us had been gathering for weeks. It was hidden behind a crumbling brick building that had once been a printing shop, shielded from the main avenue by overgrown bushes and a chain-link fence with a convenient hole near the back corner. When I slipped through that opening in the fence around 8 at night, there were already 5 people gathered around a rusty oil barrel that Jerome had dragged there a month earlier. Jerome was a Vietnam veteran, probably in his late 60s, with a gray beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen too much of everything. He had a way of keeping the group calm, a quiet authority that did not come from intimidation, but from experience. Sitting beside him was a woman everyone called Birdie because she always fed pigeons with any piece of bread she could find. There was also Tommy, a skinny kid who could not have been more than 22. Running from something he never talked about. And there were the Pratt brothers, Lenny and Gus, who had been living on the street together since their mother died and left them nothing but debt. The fire inside that barrel was the only warm thing for several blocks, and we protected it as if it were something sacred. The night started like any other. We passed around a bottle of cheap whiskey Gus had gotten from somewhere, and Jerome told one of his stories about his time in Da Nang. Birdie hummed to herself while sorting through a plastic bag full of things she had collected during the day. Small treasures that meant nothing to anyone else, but meant everything to her. I had managed to pull a pretty decent haul from the dumpster behind a grocery store on Hawthorne. Some bruised apples, half a loaf of bread that was only a little stale, and 2 dented cans of beans that were still sealed. I shared what I had because that was how things worked among us. You gave when you could and took when you needed, with no questions and no keeping score. The fire snapped and crackled inside the barrel, throwing small sparks into the black sky. And for a moment it almost felt peaceful. The temperature had dropped to around 30 degrees, and every time we exhaled, thick clouds formed in front of our faces. We all stayed close to the barrel, nearly touching shoulders, trying to get any trace of warmth from the flames and from each other. Trouble came through the hole in the fence around 10:30, wearing a torn military jacket and carrying a backpack that looked ready to burst. His name was Ray Durkin, and everyone on the street knew it was better to stay away from him. He must have been around 45, with the build of a man who had spent time locked up and had used every minute in the prison yard. His shaved head was covered in badly done tattoos, and a scar ran from his left eyebrow down to his jaw. Ray had a reputation for violence, and he had earned it. 2 winters earlier, I had seen him break a man's arm over a place to sleep near the Willamette River, and the sound of that bone snapping still sometimes visits me in my dreams. He entered our circle as if the place belonged to him, dropped his backpack onto the ground with a heavy thud, and immediately started warming his hands over our fire without even nodding to anyone. Jerome tensed beside me, and I noticed Tommy slowly beginning to back into the shadows. Even Lenny, who usually always had a joke or a comment ready, went completely silent. For a while, no one said anything. We just stood there in that uncomfortable silence, with the fire crackling between us. Ray stood on the other side of the barrel, his eyes moving over us one by one, as if he were sizing up prey. Jerome finally broke the silence by offering Ray a drink from the whiskey bottle, a peace gesture I had seen him use before to diffuse tense situations. Ray snatched it from him without a word, took 3 long pulls, and then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He did not give it back. Instead, he set it on the ground beside his backpack and started rummaging through his things, pulling out a filthy sleeping bag and a tarp that looked as if it had been dragged through mud. Bertie kept her head down, her fingers moving nervously inside her plastic bag, and I could hear her breathing getting faster. I wanted to say something, to tell Ray there were other places he could set up, but I knew perfectly well that it was not wise to make myself a target. So I just stayed seated, my jaw clenched, watching him settle in like a storm cloud that had decided to park itself right in the middle of our little shelter. The argument started about an hour later, and it came out of nowhere, like a punch you do not see coming. Gus had been growing more and more restless as the night went on, murmuring things to Lenny that I could not fully make out. At some point, Ray must have heard something because he snapped his head toward the brothers, and his face hardened like concrete. He stood up slowly, and although the fire was between them, I could feel the heat of his anger radiating more strongly than any flame. He pointed a thick finger at Gus and asked him where he had gotten his jacket, the military jacket he was wearing. Gus stammered something about having found it, that he had taken it from a donation bin outside a church on Glisson Street 3 weeks earlier. But Ray did not accept the explanation. He circled the barrel in 4 quick steps and grabbed Gus by the collar of the jacket, lifting him almost off the ground as if he weighed nothing. That jacket was his, Ray said through his teeth. It had been stolen from his camp 2 months earlier, while he was in county jail for a few days on an assault charge. Whether that was true or not, I could not say. But in that moment, it did not matter. Truth rarely matters when a violent man decides he has been wronged. Lenny jumped to his feet to defend his brother, which was exactly the worst thing he could have done. He shoved Ray hard in the chest, trying to make him let go of Gus. And for a second, it actually worked. Ray stepped back and released Gus, who fell to the ground, gasping and clutching his throat. But then Ray's face changed into something I can only describe as empty, as if someone had flipped a switch and whatever trace of humanity had been behind those eyes had gone dark. He lunged at Lenny with a fury that was terrifying to witness, throwing punches that connected with flesh and bone in wet, heavy sounds. Jerome tried to intervene, grabbing Ray's arm from behind, but Ray turned and drove an elbow into his temple, sending the old man down onto the dirt. Bertie was already screaming, a high-pitched shriek that seemed to bounce off the brick walls around us. I was standing, but my legs would not respond. I was caught somewhere between the instinct to help and the instinct to survive. Tommy had already vanished through the hole in the fence. Smart kid. The whole scene happened as if in slow motion, although it was probably only 15 or 20 seconds of pure chaos. Then it happened. Ray had Lenny pinned to the ground and was still hitting him, even though Lenny had already stopped defending himself. Then Gus came up behind him with a broken piece of concrete he had grabbed from somewhere. He brought it down hard on Ray's shoulder. Not on his head, only on his shoulder. But it was enough to make Ray howl in pain and roll away from his brother. Ray jumped to his feet, his face twisted with rage, and charged toward the oil barrel. I thought he was trying to grab something to use as a weapon. maybe one of the pieces of wood we had been feeding into the fire, but instead he shoved the entire barrel with one violent motion, as if he wanted to set the whole world on fire if he could not win the fight. The barrel tipped over with a horrible metallic screech, and the burning wood and embers inside spilled across the dry brush and trash that covered the ground of the lot. For a moment, all of us froze, watching as those small flames caught and spread like living things looking for something to devour. The fire moved faster than I ever would have imagined. One second it was only a few patches of burning grass, and the next it was a wall of orange and yellow racing across the lot toward the old printing shop. The dry fall had turned everything into tinder. The dead grass, the piles of cardboard we used as bedding, the wooden pallets stacked against the fence. Everything burned as if it had been soaked in gasoline. The heat hit me in a wave that made me stumble backward, and the smoke came right after, thick black, suffocating. I heard Bertie coughing somewhere to my left, reached out blindly, grabbed her arm, and started dragging her toward the hole in the fence. Jerome was already on his feet, blood running down one side of his face from where Ray had hit him with his elbow, and he was shouting at the Pratt brothers to move. But Lenny was not moving. He was still on the ground where Ray had left him, curled on his side, and Gus was trying to drag him away from the flames, which were getting closer every second. Ray had disappeared. He had slipped through the smoke and the night like the coward he was, leaving the rest of us to deal with the nightmare he had created. I got Bertie to the fence and practically shoved her through the hole, yelling at her to run and not look back. Then I turned around and ran back into that hell because I could not leave the others inside. The smoke was so dense that I could barely see 3 feet in front of me, and the heat was unbearable, pressing against my skin as if it had physical weight. I found Jerome first, staggering in the wrong direction, disoriented by the blow to his head unbearable, pressing against my skin as if it had physical weight. I found Jerome first, staggering in the wrong direction, disoriented by the blow to his head. I grabbed him by the arm, pointed him toward the fence, and told him to follow the brick wall, that it would lead him to the opening. Then I went to look for Gus and Lenny. I found them near the center of the lot, surrounded by flames on 3 sides. Gus had managed to get Lenny sitting up, but Lenny's face was a mess of blood and swelling, and one of his eyes was completely shut. His left arm hung at an angle that turned my stomach, clearly broken in at least one place. The fire had reached a pile of old tires near the edge of the lot, and the flames coming from there looked like something out of a horror movie. Black smoke rose in a column that blocked out the stars above us. I knew we had maybe 30 seconds before our only escape route was cut off. I grabbed Lenny's good arm and slung it over my shoulder while Gus took him from the other side. Between the two of us, we half-carried, half-dragged him toward the fence. Lenny screamed with every step, a raw animal sound that I still hear sometimes when the night gets too quiet. The fire was roaring by then, truly roaring, as if some enormous beast were breathing right behind us. I could feel the hair on my arms singeing from the heat. Sparks fell on us like burning snow, landing on our clothes and skin, leaving small stinging burns that we did not have time to care about. We reached the fence just as the flames devoured the spot where we had been standing only moments earlier. I pushed Lenny through the hole first, with as much gentleness as I could manage, which in truth was not much. Gus crawled through after him. I was the last one out, and as I squeezed through the opening in the chain-link fence, I felt the hot metal against my palms, heated by the inferno burning only a few feet away. We collapsed onto the sidewalk on the other side. All of us were gasping and coughing, our lungs full of smoke and our eyes streaming with tears. Behind us, the entire lot was on fire. The flames rose toward the sky like fingers trying to catch the moon. Someone in one of the nearby buildings must have called the fire department, because I began to hear sirens in the distance getting closer. That sound awakened something primitive in all of us. Jerome looked at me with those tired, bloodshot eyes and only slowly shook his head before limping away into the darkness between the buildings. Bertie was already gone, vanished as soon as she managed to cross the fence. Gus looked at his brother, then at me, and I saw an impossible decision form on his face. If we stayed, the paramedics would help Lenny, but the police would come too. Warrants questions the system that had failed each of us in different ways would swallow us whole again. But if we ran, maybe Lenny would not survive the night with those injuries. I made the decision for him. I told Gus to take his brother and go, that I would stay to flag down the ambulance, give a fake name, and say I had found Lenny like that on the street. Gus hesitated for only a second, then nodded and began dragging Lenny away from the growing glow of the fire. I sat on that cold sidewalk and waited for the red and blue lights to arrive, rehearsing my lie, trying to make my whole body stop shaking as the adrenaline faded and only exhaustion and a sadness so heavy it barely let me breathe remained. The paramedics found me sitting there about 5 minutes later, covered in soot and smelling like a chimney. I told them exactly what I had planned, that I was walking by and found an injured man on the sidewalk, that I had no idea what had happened to him. They did not believe me. I could see it in their eyes, but they also did not care enough to press me. They had a patient to stabilize and a fire to stay away from. The story of a homeless man was the least of their concerns. The firefighters arrived right after. 3 trucks that lit up the whole block with their flashing lights. They got to work fighting the fire, which by then had already spread to the old printing shop. I watched from across the street while they battled the flames for almost 2 hours. They finally got it under control, but not before the building was completely destroyed inside. A police officer took my statement, wrote down the fake name I gave him, and told me I could leave. I walked away from that scene with nothing but the burned clothes on my back and lungs that would ache for weeks. I later found out that Lenny had survived. Gus managed to get him to a clinic on the east side run by volunteers who did not ask questions, and they patched him up well enough. His arm healed crooked and he lost most of the vision in his left eye, but he lived. That was more than I had expected when I saw him lying in that burning lot. I never saw Ray Durkin again after that night, although I heard rumors over the years. Some said he had been caught for a 3rd felony and was serving 25 years to life somewhere in California. Others said he froze under an overpass in Seattle during a cold snap. If I am honest, I like to believe the second version because it feels like a kind of justice, although I know wishing something like that on another person is a dark thing. The rest of our little group scattered after the fire. Jerome went south. He said the cold was getting into his bones too much. Bertie ended up in a women's shelter and, from what I last heard, even managed to get into a transitional housing program. I never saw Tommy again. He simply disappeared as if he had never been there. As for me, that night changed something inside my chest. It cracked open something that had been sealed for a long time. 3 weeks later, I entered a detox program. I stopped drinking. I got a job washing dishes at a downtown restaurant. And little by little, I started climbing back towards something resembling a life. I still think about that night every time November comes back, and the air takes on that particular kind of cold. I think about how quickly everything can collapse, about how one single act of violence can destroy the fragile peace people build when they have nothing else. And I think about Jerome passing the whiskey bottle to Ray, trying to keep the peace, not knowing that some fires are already burning long before the first spark catches. Story 5. Sleeping under a bridge in March can push you to do things you swore you would never do. I had been homeless in Columbus, Ohio for about 4 months when that night happened. By then I had already broken most of my own rules just to keep surviving. Before ending up on the street, I worked in a warehouse, had roommates, and paid my bills on time. Then everything fell apart in a matter of weeks. The warehouse closed. I got pneumonia. My roommates left, and my landlord started the eviction process while I was still coughing up mucus in the waiting room of a free clinic. My mother died when I was 19, and I never knew my father, so there was no safety net waiting for me anywhere. The friends I had in high school were scattered across different states, living their own lives, and I was too ashamed to contact them and admit what had happened to me. Being a woman on the street teaches you things very quickly. You learn to trust your instincts, to avoid certain areas after dark, to never let anyone know where you sleep. I met him on a Thursday afternoon outside a coffee shop on High Street. It was cold, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and makes your teeth hurt. I was sitting on the sidewalk, my back against the brick wall, hoping someone might buy me a hot drink or drop a few coins. He came out of the coffee shop holding 2 cups and offered me one without saying anything. He was medium built, maybe in his early 40s, clean-shaven with a gray wool coat that looked expensive. He said his name was Gary and that he sometimes volunteered at a downtown shelter. We talked for maybe 10 minutes, a completely normal conversation. The weather, how hard the winter had been, how the city should do more for people like me. He had a calm, gentle way of speaking, like a therapist or a pastor. When he offered me $50 and a warm place to sleep that night, no strings attached, I wanted to say no. Every instinct I had developed on the street screamed at me to reject the offer. But I was exhausted, freezing, and he seemed so sincere. I told myself I could handle whatever happened. I was wrong in a way that still shows up in my nightmares. His car was a dark blue sedan, clean inside, smelling like pine air freshener. He drove carefully, obeying every speed limit, using his turn signals. During the drive, we talked about simple things, and he asked me questions about myself, where I was from, how long I had been on the street, whether I had family. I kept my answers vague, and he seemed to respect that. He told me he lived alone, that he had been divorced for a few years, and that he worked in insurance claims. Everything about him screamed normal. The drive lasted about 20 minutes, into a residential area I did not recognize. There were a lot of old houses set back from the street with large yards. His house was 2 stories and sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. There were no neighbors close enough to hear a scream. That detail registered in my mind, but I pushed it aside. He drove the car into the garage and the door closed automatically behind us before we had even gotten out of the vehicle. I remember thinking it was a little strange, but I told myself that people with money simply had different habits. Inside, the house was orderly, almost too orderly. Everything looked like it had come out of a catalog. Matching furniture, no dust, no clutter, no personal photos on the walls. He gave me a quick tour of the first floor, the living room, the kitchen, a small bathroom. He pointed toward a hallway and mentioned that the basement was off limits because he used it for storage and it was a mess. The way he said it, casual but firm, made me look toward the door. It had a heavy deadbolt, the kind you would expect to see on an exterior door, not at the entrance to a basement. I noticed another door near the kitchen with the same kind of lock. He caught me looking and smiled. He said he had become paranoid about break-ins since his divorce. That explanation made sense on the surface, but something tightened in my chest. Over the past few months, I had learned to pay attention to that feeling. More than once, it had kept me safe, but I was already inside, warm for the first time in days, and I convinced myself I was overreacting. He offered me a shower and clean clothes. He said his ex-wife had left some things that might fit me. The upstairs bathroom was spotless. White tile, fluffy towels, expensive-looking soap. I locked the door and checked the lock twice before undressing. The hot water felt incredible, and I stayed under the stream longer than I should have, letting the warmth sink into my muscles. When I got out, I noticed there was no window in the bathroom, just a smooth wall of drywall where there should have been one. The clothes he left outside the door were carefully folded. Sweatpants, a long-sleeve shirt, thick socks. They smelled like fabric softener. I put them on and went downstairs to find him in the kitchen heating soup on the stove. He had set the table with 2 bowls, 2 spoons and napkins, as if we were old friends having dinner together. The soup was canned chicken noodle, nothing special. He sat across from me and watched me eat with an expression I could not quite interpret. He did not seem hungry or impatient. He just watched. I finished the bowl faster than I meant to, and he immediately offered me more. After dinner, he showed me the guest room where I would sleep. It was upstairs at the end of the hallway with a twin bed, a dresser, and nothing else. No lamp, no nightstand, no decorations. The window had thick curtains pulled shut. When I moved them aside just a little, I saw metal bars outside the glass. Security bars, the kind people install in dangerous neighborhoods to prevent break-ins. But this was not a dangerous neighborhood, and every other house I had seen on the way had normal windows. I asked him about it, and he shrugged. He said the previous owners must have installed them and that he had never bothered to remove them. His voice stayed calm, but his eyes remained fixed on my face a second too long. I told him I was tired and wanted to sleep. He nodded, wished me good night, and closed the door behind him. I waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway and then tested the handle. It turned. The door opened. I exhaled. Maybe I really was just being paranoid. I left the door cracked open and lay down on the bed without taking off my shoes. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember is waking to the sound of the door closing with a click. The room was dark, completely dark, and I could not see anything. Out of habit, I reached for my phone before remembering that I had not had a working cell phone in months. I stayed absolutely still, listening. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, then silence. I slid out of bed as slowly as I could and moved toward the door. When I grabbed the handle and turned it, nothing happened. The door was locked from the outside. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I tried again, twisting the handle harder, pulling, pushing. Nothing. I pressed my ear against the wood and heard breathing on the other side, steady, patient, like someone waiting. I backed away from the door and bumped into the dresser, knocking something onto the floor. The breathing stopped. Then footsteps sounded again, moving away down the hallway. I stood there in the dark, shaking, trying to think of what to do. I felt along the wall until I found the window. The curtains were heavy and I yanked them aside, letting in a sliver of light from somewhere outside. Maybe a street light. Maybe the moon. The bars on the window were solid, bolted to the frame from the outside. I pushed against them anyway, knowing it was useless. My eyes slowly adjusted and I began searching the room for anything I could use. The dresser was empty, all the drawers bare. The bed had no frame, just a mattress on the floor. There was no closet, no objects, nothing. It was like a cell designed to look like a bedroom. I went back to the door and examined it more carefully. The lock was a simple latch mechanism, the kind that could be opened with a flathead screwdriver or a butter knife. I did not have either of those things, but I did have a zipper on my jacket, a metal one with teeth. I took off the jacket and tried to wedge the zipper pull into the gap between the door and the frame, aiming for the latch. My fingers were clumsy with fear, but I kept trying, scraping and pushing for what felt like an hour. At last, the latch gave with a small click that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. I froze, waiting for footsteps, waiting for him to come running. Nothing. I opened the door inch by inch, holding my breath. The hallway was dark, but I could see a faint glow coming from downstairs. Maybe a television or a lamp left on. I stepped out of the room and immediately noticed another door on the other side of the hallway, one I had not seen during the quick tour. It was slightly open, and through the crack I could see a desk covered in monitors, 4 or 5 of them, showing different angles of the house. The guest room, the bathroom, the kitchen, the garage. He had cameras everywhere. On one of the screens I saw myself, a grainy figure standing motionless in the hallway, and I understood that he could be watching me at that very moment from anywhere in the house. I forced myself to move. I headed for the stairs, keeping close to the wall to avoid any boards that might creak. Every step felt like a gamble. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down into the living room below. Empty. The front door was maybe 30 feet away. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard his voice behind me. Calm, almost kind. He said my name, the fake name I had given him earlier, and asked where I was going. I did not turn around. I ran. I took the stairs 2 at a time, nearly tripping when I reached the bottom, and bolted toward the front door. My hand hit the deadbolt. I turned it, yanked the door open, and felt the cold night air on my face for one beautiful second before his hand closed around my arm and dragged me backward. I screamed hard, a raw scream, knowing there were no neighbors close enough to hear me, but screaming anyway. He dragged me back into the living room and threw me to the floor. He was stronger than he looked, much stronger, and his face had changed completely. The kind, concerned expression was gone. His eyes were flat and empty, as if he had switched something off inside himself. He stood over me and told me I should not have done that things could have been easy if I had simply cooperated. He bent down to grab me again, and I did the only thing I could think of. I bit his hand with all my strength, sinking my teeth into the flesh between his thumb and index finger until I tasted blood. He screamed and jerked backward, and in that second I rolled to the side and got to my feet. There was a lamp on a small table beside the couch, and I grabbed it without thinking. I swung it at his head just as he lunged toward me. The base struck his temple. He did not fall, but he staggered enough to give me a few seconds. I ran for the front door again, but somehow he had locked it again. The deadbolt would not move. The kitchen. I remembered the back door near the kitchen. I tore through the living room, knocking a chair over behind me to slow him down, and reached the kitchen. The back door had a chain, a deadbolt, and a regular lock. My fingers tangled with all three while I heard him coming closer, cursing and breathing hard, his footsteps getting nearer and nearer. The chain came loose. The deadbolt turned. The lock clicked. I threw the door open and ran into the backyard. The grass was cold and wet beneath my feet. I headed for the fence at the edge of the property. It was wooden, maybe 6 feet high, and I hit it at full speed, grabbing the top and pulling my body up. I felt a hand close around my ankle, and I kicked backward with all the strength I had. My heel struck something solid. His grip loosened, and I managed to push myself over the top of the fence, splinters digging into my palms. I fell on the other side, into an empty lot full of dry weeds and broken glass. I did not stop. I ran through the lot, across someone's driveway, down a street I did not recognize. I just ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt ready to give out. I found a gas station about a mile away. The lights were bright and seemed welcoming, and I stumbled inside, a complete wreck. I was barefoot because I had lost my shoes at some point, bleeding from my hands, crying and shaking. The woman behind the counter called the police. I told them everything. They went to the house, but Gary was already gone. He had cleaned the place out in a matter of hours. He took the monitors, took anything that could identify him. The police said they would investigate, but I could see in their faces that they did not expect to find him. I spent 2 nights in a shelter after that and then got a bus ticket to another city. I never went back to Columbus. Story 6. No one warns you how quiet the world becomes after midnight when you sleep outside. My name does not matter anymore, but people used to call me Eddie, back when I had a job installing drywall in a studio apartment in Tucson. That life ended somewhere between my second back surgery and the opioid prescription my insurance stopped covering. By the spring of 2024, my 53rd birthday had already passed without any celebration, and I had been sleeping behind the recycling center on Canova Road for almost 8 months. I knew every shortcut in the city, every relatively safe corner where I could rest, every business that would let me use the bathroom without giving me trouble. I also knew which streets to avoid after dark, and it was exactly that knowledge that led me into that alley the night everything changed. It was a Wednesday, I remember, because the shelter on 5th Avenue served hot soup on Wednesdays, and I had managed to fill my stomach for the first time in 2 days. The Ridley Heights neighborhood had deteriorated badly over the past year. Drug deals happened openly on the corners, and in the last month alone, 3 people had been shot there. Normally, I took the long way around, adding 20 more minutes to get back to my sleeping spot. But that night, my legs hurt from walking all day looking for aluminum cans to recycle. The alley behind the old textile factory seemed like a reasonable compromise. It was a direct route that would keep me away from the main streets while cutting across only the edge of the dangerous area. I had used it maybe a couple of times before without any incident. The entrance sat between a closed pawn shop and a building that had once been a check-cashing place, both covered in graffiti and protected by rusty security bars. A single streetlight flickered at the far end, casting orange shadows that jumped and trembled against the brick walls. I pulled my jacket tighter, adjusted the backpack that held everything I owned, and stepped into the darkness accompanied only by the sound of my own footsteps. The alley stretched farther than I remembered, maybe 200 yards of cracked asphalt covered with broken bottles and fast food wrappers. To the left were dumpsters, overflowing with garbage no one had collected in weeks. The smell hit me about 30 feet in. That sour mix of rotten food and stagnant water collected in potholes that never drained right. I kept my head down and walked with purpose. That is how you learn to move when you live on the street. You never want to look lost or vulnerable. You never want to give the impression that you are an easy target. Halfway through, I passed a shopping cart jammed against a chain-link fence, its wheels torn off and rusted into immobility. Someone had abandoned it there months earlier, and now it served as a kind of landmark, a sign that I had reached the midpoint. That fence separated the alley from an empty lot where the city had demolished an old warehouse 2 years before. They never built anything new. They simply left it as a flat stretch of weeds and concrete rubble. I was about 20 feet past the cart when I heard it. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a cat in distress or a dog whining somewhere in the lot. The sound was muffled, distant, coming from the other side of the fence. I slowed down but kept walking, telling myself it was none of my business. In my world, curiosity can get you killed, beaten, or robbed. You learn to keep your eyes forward and your mouth shut. But the sound came again, louder this time, and I recognized it for what it was. A human voice. Someone was screaming. The sound cut off suddenly, as if a hand had covered their mouth. I stopped. My heart began hammering against my ribs, and I felt sweat break out on my forehead despite the cool night air. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to pretend I had not heard anything, to get out of that alley and never look back. But my feet did not obey. I slowly moved closer to the fence, keeping close to the dumpsters where the shadows were thicker. The chain link had holes in several places, opened by vandals or maybe by people like me looking for shortcuts. Through one of those openings, I could see the lot. The moon had come out from behind the clouds, spilling pale light over the weeds and broken chunks of concrete. At first, I saw nothing, only empty space and the skeletal remains of the warehouse foundation. Then movement caught my eye near the far corner, maybe 50 yards from where I stood. 2 figures. No, 3. One on the ground. 2 standing over it. I narrowed my eyes, trying to understand what I was seeing. One of the standing figures drew his arm back and brought something down. The blow that followed was sickening. A wet, heavy sound I had never heard before, but understood immediately. The figure on the ground jerked and then went still. The other standing figure laughed, a short laugh, almost an amused bark that bounced across the empty lot and reached my ears with terrible clarity. My body reacted before my mind could process what I had just witnessed. I pressed myself against the dumpster, making myself as small as possible. Through the hole in the fence, I watched the 2 men step away from the motionless shape lying on the ground. One was tall and heavy-set, wearing a dark sweatshirt with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. The other was shorter, wiry, with a shaved head shining under the moonlight. The tall one was holding something in his hand, maybe a pipe or a bat. From that distance, I could not make it out clearly. He wiped it against his jeans and said something to his companion that I could not hear. The shorter man nodded and pulled out his phone. The screen lit his face with a ghostly blue glow. They seemed calm, in no hurry, as if they had all the time in the world, as if what they had just done was nothing more than a minor errand. The person on the ground had not moved since that last blow, and I knew, with horrible certainty, that I was looking at a body. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run through that fence, throw myself at those men, and somehow save whoever was bleeding out in the weeds. But I am not a hero. I am a 53-year-old man with a damaged back, malnutrition, and no weapon except a dull pocket knife I used to open cans. Those 2 would have killed me without effort, and then there would have been 2 bodies in that lot instead of 1. So I did the only thing I could do. I forced myself to breathe slowly, silently, fighting the urge to gasp. I counted to 10 in my head, then to 20, waiting for them to leave. The tall man lit a cigarette, and the flame from the lighter briefly illuminated a face with a crooked nose and a thick beard. He took a long drag and released the smoke toward the sky, completely relaxed. The shorter one finished whatever he was doing on his phone and put it back in his pocket. They exchanged a few more words, looked one last time toward the body, and then started walking toward the opposite end of the lot, where an opening in the perimeter fence led out to Dexter Street. I waited until they disappeared into the shadows on the other side. Then I waited another full minute, counting the seconds in my mind, terrified that they might come back or that one of them might somehow have seen me. When I finally moved, my legs felt as if they belonged to someone else. I stumbled backward, away from the fence, my eyes still fixed on the dark shape lying motionless in the lot. Part of me wanted to go closer, check if they were still alive, do something. But a bigger part understood that every second I stayed there was a second wasted. Those men could come back at any moment, or someone else could show up, find me near a body, and assume the worst. I knew how those things worked. I knew who the police would believe and who they would arrest. A homeless man covered in dirt crouched near a murder victim in the middle of the night. I would spend the rest of my life in prison for a crime I did not commit. The only way to help was to find someone with a phone, someone who could call the police and send them to that exact place before it was too late, if it was not already. I ran, not with the careful, measured walk I had learned to use on the street, but with a desperate sprint toward the end of the alley. The backpack slammed against my spine with every step. My lungs burned from years of cigarettes and sleeping in cold air. I burst out onto Fremont Boulevard and looked frantically in both directions, searching for anyone. A car, a pedestrian, an open business. The street was empty. Closed storefronts lined both sides, their windows dark and protected by metal grates. I kept running, my boots hitting the sidewalk, until I saw the glow of fluorescent lights halfway down the block. A 24-hour laundromat, the kind that stayed lit all night for shift workers and insomniacs. I came through the door so hard the bell above it nearly tore loose from its bracket. Inside, a woman in her 60s was folding towels on one of the plastic tables. She looked up at me with wide eyes, her hands frozen halfway through a fold, and I understood how I must have looked. Wild-eyed, sweating, panting. A homeless man bursting in like a lunatic in the middle of the night. I tried to speak, but the words came out in fragments. Someone heard in the lot behind the factory. "Call the police, please." The woman stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Her expression was caught between fear and confusion. I thought maybe she would scream, run out, or order me to leave. But something in my face must have convinced her, because she slowly reached into her purse and pulled out a cell phone. Her name was Maxine. I learned that later. She had worked the night shift at a packaging plant for 30 years before retiring. She dialed 911 with steady fingers, while I leaned against a washing machine and tried not to collapse. I heard her describe the location, repeat it when the operator asked for clarification, and then she handed me the phone. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, asking questions I struggled to answer. How many attackers? What did they look like? Was the victim still breathing? I told them everything I could remember. The tall one with the beard, the short one with the shaved head, the weapon that might have been a pipe or a bat. I told them the men had walked toward Dexter Street. I told them to hurry. To please hurry because someone was dying in that empty lot while we were talking. The police arrived at the laundromat 14 minutes after the call. I know because I watched the clock on the wall the whole time, every minute stretching until it became unbearable. 2 officers took my statement while Maxine made instant coffee in foam cups and handed them out as if we were at some grim midnight meeting. They asked me the same questions the operator had already asked, and then asked them again in different ways, looking for contradictions. I understood. I was a witness with no address, no identification, nothing to prove I was telling the truth. One of the officers drove me back to the lot in his patrol car. There were already more police there, their red and blue lights painting the nearby buildings in pulses of color. Yellow tape had been stretched across the opening in the fence. I watched from the back seat as the paramedics came out of the lot carrying a stretcher. The body on it was covered with a white sheet. No one was running. No one was doing cardiopulmonary resuscitation or shouting orders. They moved with that slow, deliberate rhythm of people who had arrived too late. The officer beside me said something, maybe an attempt at comfort, but I did not hear the words. The only thing I could think about was the sound of that last blow, that wet impact that would echo inside my skull for years. They found the two men 3 days later. Someone talked. A girlfriend, a neighbor, or maybe someone who wanted the reward money the victim's family had offered. The tall one was named Carl Denning and was 41 years old. 3 prior convictions for assault. The shorter one was his cousin, Ricky Slade, 26, who had been in and out of county jail since he turned 18. The victim was James Okonkwo, a 23-year-old college student walking home from his job at a warehouse. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong neighborhood. The detectives told me my description helped narrow the suspect list, that my willingness to come forward made a difference. But it did not feel like a difference. James Okonkwo was still dead. His mother still had to identify his body. His friends still had to bury him. I did what I could, and it was not enough. And I have carried that weight every day since. Some nights I still wake up in whatever doorway or shelter bed I have managed to find, gasping, hearing that laugh bounce across an empty lot. I tell myself I made the right choice. I tell myself going in there alone would only have gotten me killed too. But the truth is that I will never know if I could have saved him. I will never know whether 30 seconds of courage could have changed everything. And that uncertainty, that permanent maybe, is what haunts me more than anything those 2 men could have done to my body. Story 7. At that point in my life, I was staying at a women's shelter on the outskirts of the city, trying to keep my days organized so I would not fall apart. Mornings consisted of lining up early, keeping my clothes as clean as possible, and checking the bulletin board in case any cash-paying work showed up. That day started like all the others, with watery coffee and the smell of disinfectant soaked into everything I owned. I left before dawn for a day labor pickup spot near an old gas station, where contractors sometimes showed up looking for help. Most days you waited for hours and came back empty-handed, but hope has a strange way of making you stay there anyway. I kept telling myself I only needed one small chance to get back on my feet. Rental deposits, bus passes, and even a cheap motel felt impossibly far away. That morning seemed ordinary enough to forget. I did not know then how precisely I would remember every detail later. While we were waiting, a man parked across the street and watched the line for a while without getting out of the car. He looked clean, well-fed, and out of place compared to the rest of us. After a few minutes, he crossed over and said he needed help cleaning a house he was preparing to sell. He spoke calmly, said it would only take a few hours, and promised to pay cash at the end of the day. No paperwork, no questions, just a simple cleaning job. When he spoke, he looked directly at me, as if he had already made a decision. I hesitated, but the others were already shaking their heads or taking a step back. Something about how quickly he chose me should have mattered more. Instead, I focused on the idea of having money in my pocket before nightfall. I accepted before giving myself time to talk myself out of it. The drive was not long, but the landscape changed faster than I expected. The houses started spreading apart, the streetlights disappeared, and the road narrowed until it felt forgotten. He did not talk much, only making small comments about the weather and traffic, as if we were co-workers. When we arrived, the house sat alone beside a line of trees, with no neighboring homes close enough to see us. The place looked empty in a way that felt intentional, not abandoned. There were no cars, no trash bins, no curtains in the windows. He opened the door and gestured for me to go in first. The air inside smelled closed up, like dust and old wood, not like a place that was actively being prepared for a sale. I asked where the cleaning supplies were, trying to sound casual. That was when he closed the door behind us and did not answer. At first, I assumed there had been some misunderstanding and tried to keep my tone light. I told him I could leave and come back later if it was not a good time. He positioned himself between the door and me without raising his voice, saying we needed to talk first. The way he blocked the exit felt deliberate, as if he had rehearsed the movement. That was when I noticed how silent the house was. There was no hum from any appliance, no distant traffic, nothing. My phone had no signal, only one empty bar at the top of the screen. He told me there was no cleaning job and started asking me questions that had nothing to do with work. Every answer I gave seemed to encourage him to step a little closer. I understood then that leaving calmly was no longer an option. Whatever this was, it was already moving in a direction I could not afford to follow. I tried to slow everything down by talking, asking questions that did not matter, pretending this was still a normal conversation. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, as if it belonged to someone braver. He began circling the room, explaining that the house had belonged to his family, that no one went there anymore. He kept mentioning how people disappeared inside their routines and how easy it was for someone to be forgotten. Each sentence weighed more than the last. I slowly moved toward a hallway, pretending to look for the bathroom. I just needed space to think. He noticed immediately and told me not to wander. That was when the fear stopped being an abstract idea and became physical, pressing behind my ribs. I understood that every minute I stayed passive made things worse. The hallway led to empty rooms with bare floors and blank walls, as if the house had been stripped on purpose. I noticed the windows were nailed shut from the outside. The wood looked splintered and uneven. The back door had a metal latch that I could not open from my side. When I returned to the main room, he was watching me with the patience of someone waiting for a clock to run out. He told me I could sit down, that no one was in a hurry. My phone buzzed with a low battery warning, which felt cruel. I asked again to use the bathroom, this time sounding desperate, and he nodded too quickly. As I walked away, I realized he trusted the house more than he needed to watch me. That was the first opportunity I saw. In the bathroom, the mirror was split by a crack running down the center, dividing my face into two uneven versions of myself. I locked the door and searched the room for anything useful. The window was small, but it was not sealed like the others, only stuck shut under layers of paint. I grabbed the towel bar and pulled on it until the screws tore out of the wall. The noise echoed through the whole house, followed by his footsteps moving fast. I broke the window with the metal bar, ignoring the burn of glass cutting my arm. Cold air rushed in, sharp and real. He started yelling, telling me to stop, that I was making a mistake. I did not stop. I was already halfway out when he reached the door. The fall outside was clumsy but bearable, and I hit the ground so hard the air left my lungs. I did not look back. My legs moved on instinct, through weeds and uneven ground toward the road. I remember branches scratching my face and my shoes filling with dirt, but I kept running. When I reached the pavement, a car slowed down. The driver looked at me as if I were something out of a nightmare. I waved my arms and collapsed onto the shoulder, the words coming out of me too fast to make sense. The driver called for help and stayed with me until other people arrived. Later, the authorities went to the house and found it empty again, as if it had already decided to erase itself. I still think about how close I came to becoming another person whose absence no one noticed. The shelter took me back that night without asking too many questions. They only handed me a blanket and a cup of soup that trembled between my hands. I did not sleep at all. Every time someone walked past my bunk, my body tensed, expecting to see him standing there, as if he had been waiting. The next morning, a social worker sat with me in a small office and wrote everything down while I talked. Saying it out loud made it sound unreal, as if I were describing a movie I barely remembered watching. She told me I had done the right thing, that predators often look for people who would not be missed right away. That phrase stayed with me more than anything else. She did not mean to hurt me, but it did. A few days later, an officer stopped by the shelter to ask me more questions. They showed me photos of houses on the outskirts of the city, trying to see if any looked familiar. None did. The place I remembered seemed not to exist anymore, at least not on paper. The officer explained that sometimes people used empty properties temporarily, moving on before anyone realized. There was not much they could do without an exact location. Hearing that left my chest hollow. It meant he was still out there looking for someone else. The officer suggested I avoid day labor pickup spots for a while and stay close to places with cameras and staff. The advice felt small compared to what had happened, but I took it seriously. Over time, I found steady work through a church program, cleaning offices in the afternoons. It was not glamorous, but there were people around and locked doors that opened from the inside. Every time a man spoke too softly or stood too close, my body reacted before my mind did. I learned to trust that reaction without letting it control me. I started saving again, slowly and carefully. I also started talking with other women at the shelter, sharing what happened to me without giving details that might frighten the hope out of them. I told them to listen to those moments that felt wrong, even when nothing obvious was happening. Those conversations mattered more than I expected. Posting this now is not so much about closing a wound as it is about giving it clarity. That day taught me how thin the line is between surviving and disappearing, especially when you are already on the margins. I do not know what his plan was or how far he would have gone, and maybe it is better not to know. What I do know is that leaving when I did changed everything. Now I live in a small apartment, nothing special, but the door locks and the windows open freely. Some nights I still dream about that house and wake up counting exits. Other nights I sleep until morning, and that feels like a victory I earned the hardest way. Story 8. At that time, my life had been reduced to whatever fit inside my backpack and whatever gesture of kindness the night decided to offer me. Sleep came in fragments, almost always on benches or behind closed businesses, and most days blended into one another in a silent struggle to stay clean enough not to draw attention. That afternoon had been colder than usual, the kind of cold that slips through thin fabric and settles into your bones. A gas station on the outskirts of the city glowed like a small island of safety. The fluorescent lights buzzed and insects trapped against the glass stirred beneath the glow. I went inside because I needed water and a place to rinse my face. Nothing more ambitious than that. My reflection in the bathroom mirror barely looked like someone with a past. It was just a man with tired eyes and cracked lips. The faucet sputtered a little before giving me warm water, and even that felt like a gift. For a few minutes, the outside world stopped pressing down on me. The bathroom smelled like disinfectant layered over something older and sour, the kind of smell that never fully goes away. I leaned against the wall, letting the silence wrap around me, counting my breaths until the pain in my feet began to loosen. There was no clock inside, only the faint music from the store speakers filtering through the walls. At some point, the music stopped and was replaced by the sharp sound of metal striking somewhere near the entrance. A hard bang shook the door, followed by another, this time stronger, making the handle vibrate. Someone shouted something muffled, words lost between the steel and the echo. I pulled the handle by instinct and felt resistance immediately. The lock had shifted, firm and final, like a decision that had already been made. Panic did not come all at once. It seeped in slowly, in a humiliating way. I pounded on the door from the inside, trying to keep my voice steady as I said there was someone inside. The knocks answered me once more, faster, and then stopped completely. The silence settled so deeply that I could hear my own breathing bouncing off the tiles. The light stayed on, but the building felt hollow, emptied of people and intention. I had no phone in my pocket, no bottle of water on the sink, nothing connecting me to anyone outside that room. Time began to stretch in strange ways, the minutes swelling into something heavier. Hunger gave way to thirst, and thirst became the only thing I could think about. Every sound from the street felt distant, as if it belonged to another version of the world. Hours passed with nothing but the hum of the lights and my own thoughts turning sharp. Sitting on the floor, I understood how invisible I had become, how easy it was for a place to close its doors and forget that someone like me existed. If something had happened to me in there, there would have been no name spoken and no number dialed. The door did not care who was leaning against it or how long he stayed silent. That realization hit harder than the locked handle or my dry mouth. When morning finally came and the door opened, the employee looked surprised, then embarrassed, and then relieved. All at once, I stepped back out into the daylight, changed in a way that is hard to explain. Since then, I have never stopped thinking about how close disappearance really is, and how no one would have known anything if I had disappeared. As soon as the door opened, the light came in as if it had weight, and I had to cover my eyes. The employee kept apologizing. saying the lock must have jammed by accident, that they never checked the bathroom before closing. I nodded because it was easier than explaining anything. My legs felt weak when I stood up, tingling running through my feet as if they no longer belonged to me. I asked for water and drank it too fast, spilling some down my chin, not caring how I looked. People glanced at me for a second and then returned to their own routines, coffee cups and lottery tickets. The morning was already swallowing the night. No one asked how long I had been in there. No one asked if I was okay. I went outside and sat on the curb, letting the cold concrete anchor me. Cars came and went, engines starting, doors slamming shut. The normal rhythm of a day beginning. From the outside, the place looked harmless. Just another gas station people forget as soon as they drive away. I could not stop thinking about the lock, about how one small turn of metal had erased me from the building without anyone noticing. If I had not pounded on the door, if the employee had not opened it when he did, the story could have ended in a very different way. That thought lodged itself in my chest, heavy and uncomfortable. I watched the sky grow lighter and wondered how many times things like that happen without there being an ending. Later that day, I tried to keep going like always, but everything felt sharper. The thirst came back quickly, my throat reminding me how fragile the body really is. Every closed door started to feel like a risk instead of a refuge. I kept replaying the sounds in my head, the knocks, the sudden silence, the way the air went stale after hours without movement. It was not just fear anymore. It was clarity. Being homeless does not only mean lacking a place to sleep, it means existing on the edge of other people's attention. The moment that attention fades, you are left alone with whatever happens next. That night, I did not look for enclosed spaces. I stayed somewhere I could see the sky, where no door could decide my fate. The experience did not turn me into a different person overnight, but it did tear something out of me. I understood how easily I could disappear inside a locked room, a stairwell, a forgotten corner of a building. Since then, I pay attention to exits, to sounds, to the simple fact of being seen. The world did not change after that day, but I did. And even now, when I pass a gas station late at night, I remember how close I came to becoming a story no one ever told. In the days that followed, the memory kept returning at strange moments. Washing my hands in a public sink tightened my chest. Hearing a lock click somewhere nearby caught my attention instantly. I caught myself studying doors, hinges, the way handles fit into their frames, as if they were clues to something dangerous. It was not exactly paranoia, but an awareness sharpened by experience. People walked past me every day, close enough for me to smell the soap on their clothes or their coffee. And still none of them knew how close I had come to being locked inside for an entire night. I understood how thin the line is between being part of the world and being forgotten inside it. Over time, I told another man who lived on the street what had happened, someone who had been out there longer than me. He listened quietly, nodding, not surprised at all. He said something that stayed with me. Buildings do not see people, only schedules. Closing time does not care who is still inside. That idea haunted me more than the locked door. Systems run smoothly because they are not designed to notice individuals like us. If you fall outside the expected flow, you are just an error no one reports. Standing there, I understood that the most frightening part had not been the fear or the thirst, but how normal the whole situation had been. After that, I started making small changes. I avoided going into any place without knowing at least how many exits it had. If I used a bathroom, I paid attention to sounds, to footsteps, to the jingle of keys. I asked employees questions I never would have asked before, just to make sure someone had seen me. It felt awkward, sometimes embarrassing, but staying invisible suddenly felt much worse. I did not want my existence to depend on whether someone remembered to check a door. Those hours trapped inside that bathroom reshaped the way I moved through the world, cautious but alert. In the end, nothing dramatic came of it. There was no report, no apology letter, no consequence beyond my own memory. Life went on the way it always goes on for people like me, with one day bleeding into the next. But I carry that night with me as proof of how close disappearance really is. If I had not spoken, If the timing had been just a little different, there would have been no story to post here. I am sharing this because it happened, because it could happen again, and because some people only exist while someone remembers they are there. Story 9. During the winter I am talking about, my life had been reduced to a backpack, a prepaid phone, and whatever space I could occupy without anyone noticing me. I was not exactly living on the street, not in the way people usually imagine it, but I did not have stability either. I worked odd hours cleaning offices after they closed, got paid in cash, and slept anywhere I could stay dry and go unnoticed. That rental storage facility became my provisional agreement with reality. Renting a small unit felt like a kind of loophole, something almost clever. A place with cameras, fences, and rules that kept most people away at night. I told myself it was temporary, only until I saved enough to rent a room somewhere. That night started like any other. Quiet, routine, almost boring in a way that made me relax more than I should have. The unit I used was narrow and smelled like dust and old cardboard, with a concrete floor that held the cold no matter how many layers of clothing I wore. I had my things organized with military precision so nothing would scrape or make noise if I changed position. The metal door, when I lowered it just enough, left a slit of air that felt like breathing through clenched teeth. I always waited until the facility went dark before settling in, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional thud of someone leaving late. That night, the silence felt heavier, as if the entire building were holding its breath. I remember thinking maybe it was going to rain because of the way the air pressed against my ears. At some point after I lay down, the stillness broke in a way that did not fit. Footsteps echoed down the row of units, slow and deliberate, not the hurried rhythm of someone collecting boxes before closing. Each step had weight, and the sound bounced off the metal doors in an uneven rhythm. Then came the unmistakable screech of a lock turning and a unit door being lifted nearby. I started counting the seconds between each movement without meaning to. My mind recorded every sound as if it were evidence. Whoever was there was not in a hurry, was not fumbling clumsily, was not cursing under their breath. That scared me more than anything else. Without warning, the overhead light came on, flooding the hallway with a harsh white glow that slipped through the crack under my door. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it was making its own sound. Shadows moved across the concrete as someone walked past, stopping every now and then, testing locks one by one. I could hear the faint click of metal and the soft brush of fingers against door handles. My thoughts split in two directions at once. Stay completely still and hope my presence blended into the building, or risk getting out while the noise covered me. Every instinct argued with the other, and the space around me suddenly felt too small to breathe. I pressed myself against the back wall, pulling my jacket tighter, trying to control the sound of my breathing without thinking about it too much. The footsteps stopped right outside my unit, so close I could see the shadow of shoes through the opening. There was a pause that stretched longer than it should have, followed by the soft rattle of my padlock being tested. It did not open, but the simple sound of someone touching it made my chest hurt. Whoever was out there leaned close enough for me to catch a faint smell of oil and something sharp, almost medicinal. That was when I understood how thin the metal door really was, how little separated me from being discovered. The person moved on, checking the next unit, then the next. They followed a pattern that felt methodical, not random. I shifted my weight with extreme care, inch by inch, making sure nothing scraped the floor. Despite the cold, sweat gathered at the base of my neck, and my legs started tingling from staying too still for too long. Through the crack, I could see flashes of movement every time the figure passed beneath a light. The way they stopped, listened, and then continued told me this was not casual. This was someone making sure everything was exactly as expected. A low voice carried down the row, not loud enough for me to make out words, but enough for me to know there might have been someone else speaking on a phone or using a radio. That changed everything. One person was already terrifying, but the idea that there was more than one made the air feel even heavier. I thought about the exit at the end of the hallway, how far away it was, how loud the gravel sounded under shoes. Staying hidden meant trusting that my presence had not already been noticed. Leaving meant stepping into view under full light, betting that speed would beat attention. When the footsteps moved a little farther away, I slowly lifted the door another inch, just enough to see the hallway clearly. The lights buzzed overhead, and at the far end near the office, a figure stood with a clipboard in hand, comparing something against a list. Another person came out from between the units and nodded as they passed. That was the moment I decided. I waited until both of them turned away, then slipped out, staying low and closing the door as softly as possible. Every step toward the exit seemed to echo, but no one called out to me. I did not stop moving until I was beyond the fence, my lungs burning, my hands numb, and everything I owned strapped to my back. At first, I did not go too far, just far enough to put distance between that building and me. I sat behind a row of dumpsters across the road, my knees pulled up, watching the facility from the shadows. The light stayed on longer than usual, and I saw one of them walk the perimeter fence with a flashlight, sweeping the beam across the ground in the entrance. The light illuminated the spot where I had slipped out not long before, stopped there for a moment, and then moved on. That pause told me everything I needed to know. If I had stayed inside, if I had hesitated even a little longer, I do not think I would have walked out on my own. I waited until the lights went out again before moving. My hands were stiff and my shoulders ached, more from tension than from the cold. I took a longer route away from the area, following side streets, listening for engines slowing down or footsteps changing a pace behind me. Every sound felt amplified, as if my body were still trapped inside that narrow unit. I did not sleep at all that night. I simply kept walking, stopping only when my legs threatened to give out, repeating the sequence of sounds in my head again and again. The next day, I went back during normal business hours, trying to look like an ordinary customer with a legitimate reason to be there. I packed my things quickly, avoiding eye contact, half expecting someone to stop me or ask questions. No one did. The employee in the office barely looked up. That normality was unsettling in its own way. I dropped the key into the slot, walked away, and did not look back. I did not argue with myself or tell myself I was exaggerating. After what I had heard and seen, I knew better. I never slept in another storage unit again. Shortly after that, I found another arrangement, one that did not depend on being invisible. Even now, when I hear metal doors rolling up or locks clicking into place, my body reacts before my mind does. I do not know who those people were or what would have happened if I had stayed hidden until they reached my door. What I do know is that trusting that place to keep me safe almost cost me the only thing I had left, the ability to leave under my own power.